voted to leave the EU goes back to June 2016. So we're coming up to the 5th anniversary of that. David Cameron was the Prime Minister then. He resigned the day after. He was a Remainer. He campaigned to remain, like the majority of members of Parliament. He resigned the day after as untenable. Then the party selected Theresa May to be the next Prime Minister. So that under the British system, if you're not obliged on the parliamentary clock to call a general election, it's the ruling party that can change the Prime Minister in effect by changing its own leader. And the party did that. So Theresa May went for a while as an unelected Prime Minister. That's quite common in British parliamentary history. So she was Prime Minister by party choice for a while. She was a Remainer. So this was not going to work out well. She posed as someone committed to get Brexit done, but it was all very vague. So she had her favorite phrase was the infamous phrase, Brexit means Brexit. But what does that mean? That was completely circular. And it became clear that Brexit meant what came to be labeled as Brino, which was Brexit in name only. And she was busily signing Britain back into various EU programs at the same time as she was supposedly negotiating to leave Brexit. And it just took years, and the commitments were betrayed, and it went round in circles. And Parliament, meantime, was voting down anything that she actually agreed with the European Union, which looked like separation. So Parliament was even more Remain than she was. So that helps to explain what this incredibly long timeline. She has a general election where her party is re-elected with a reduced majority, and she's effectively in a coalition government, which reduces her room to maneuver further. And then eventually the party gets rid of her 2019. So enough backbenchers make clear that they're going to vote down anything she tables in Parliament. So a majority in her own parliamentary party turned against her. So she finally agreed to resign, and that was June 7th of 2019. So now you're talking almost 3 years since the referendum. There was a party contest. Just so you know, she came to power without a party contest. So there were other candidates, but the party managed those candidates in a way that they dropped out, and eventually she was left as the only one standing. So she was Prime Minister leader and then Prime Minister by default without an actual vote in the parliamentary party. Boris Johnson had to face a vote. There were a lot of candidates, and most of them were actually Remainers. But it was clear to the backbenchers that they were going to lose the next general election unless they picked her a Brexiteer. Boris Johnson had always been on the pro-Brexit side because the delays had encouraged the British population to strengthen their slight majority, but it was a strengthening majority in favour of Brexit. So the party sensibly chose Boris Johnson. He's not particularly liked in the parliamentary party, and less so today, actually. But he was the only Brexiteer candidate, and they had to have a Brexiteer to win the next election. So he wins that election leadership race in the first round or second round, I can't remember which. It's fairly decisive. That was June of 2019, so actually exactly the third anniversary of the Brexit referendum. However, Parliament hasn't changed. There hasn't been a general election. Boris Johnson, again, like Theresa May, she takes over without a general election. It's just a party change, leadership change. So the parliamentary majority remains Remainer, and it gets more aggressive towards Boris Johnson. And there's the infamous European Union withdrawal bill that is legislated as an act, and it forces the Prime Minister to ask for an extension, another extension. Theresa May had already been through 3 or 4 extensions on leaving the European Union, and it forces him to ask for another extension if a new deal has not been passed by October 19th. Obviously, the European Union is just going to say, well, we're not going to agree a deal until October 19th, forcing an extension. So at this point, it's obvious what the tactics are. It's just extension after extension until Britain never leaves, essentially. So Boris Johnson prorogues Parliament, which means he suspends Parliament. He's going to force a general election, or he's going to make executive decisions without Parliament. And that's criticized as dictatorial, and in fact, the Supreme Court strikes it down. But his excuse as the executive is, I can't get anything done, the legislature is against me. We either have a general election, and the opposition refused a general election. So his only option to get any business done is to suspend Parliament for a while and rule as an executive without Parliament. That gets struck down by the Supreme Court, and finally there's an agreement to have a general election. That's called in October. That happens in December 2019. He has a resounding victory, interpreted as a second national referendum on Brexit, because the parties are essentially, they're all Remain apart from the Conservative Party, and the general election is, there are other policies being advertised in the manifesto, but nobody cares. It's, do you want the Brexit Party, the only mainstream Brexit Party being the Conservative Party? Confusingly, there is also a Brexit Party by name, which just won in the 2019 calendar year. It's just won the leading share of the votes in the European Union elections, just to reinforce the message from the electorate that they want to get Brexit done. And so the general election is a resounding vote of support for Boris Johnson's policy to get Brexit done. That's the main campaign slogan by the Conservative Party. So he wins a resounding majority in December 2019. There's a whole new slew of Conservative candidates who are Brexiteers. The Remainers have been encouraged not to stand again, or they've actually been deselected by their own constituencies, which is a bit like a recall in California. Those Remainer members of Parliament have been recalled. You can think of it like that, by their own constituents. So the new Parliament is overwhelmingly Brexit, at least within the Conservative Party. So Brexit is going to happen. So that gets you into 2020. The Parliament reconvenes, this new Parliament, in January 2020, and very quickly legislates to leave that month, by the end of the month. But this is the wrinkle, it's a nominal leave, in the sense that Britain is outside the European Union, but still committed to everything that it already was committed to. So it's a nominal leave for a period of 1 year. So nothing changes legally, institutionally, fiscally. Britain has exactly the same commitments as it did before. To all intents and purposes, it remains a member, except that that clock is going to run out at the end of 2020. So Britain nominally leaves January 2020. It's practically going to leave at the end of the year 2020. So at the beginning of this year, 2021. Now, there's still uncertainty in 2020 about whether it will really happen, because Parliament ratifies it, but the European Union doesn't. And during 2020, the real negotiations begin, right? So we had 4 years of negotiations under Theresa May and latterly Boris Johnson, latterly in 2019. And none of that counts for anything. The negotiations were mostly theatre. The real negotiations have to begin once Britain has nominally left, and both sides have a clock now. They have to get a deal done by the end of 2020, or it'll be a no-deal Brexit. Will return to World Trade Organization rules, and then you'll be negotiating you'll be effectively negotiating a new relationship with the European Union rather than trying to preserve anything that you already had with the European Union. So 2020, the the British side is saying it wants a zero tariff, zero quota agreement. So it's very economically focused, trade focused. And it said, if you don't give us that, we're going to leave without a deal. And Parliament makes that possible because it repeals the Benn Act. So the Benn Act is the act that obliged the Prime Minister to ask for an extension if a short period of time went by without a deal, which was a way of perpetuating the extensions. This new Parliament repeals that. So so Boris Johnson has more freedom to negotiate in 2020 than he did in 2019. However, the talks stall. They go by September of 2020. They're in their 8th round, and this is going to go to the wire. I'm not sure how much of this news you were watching, but it actually goes up till Christmas Eve of 2020 to leave by the 31st of December. So 6 days, 7 days before Britain was going to leave without a no deal, you actually get a deal. So 2020 goes by in a blink of an eye. I mean, there's COVID going on too, although there's a nominal excuse because people can negotiate by Zoom. But there were these excuses that, oh, we can't negotiate, because we can't meet in person. That was the European Union's, one of the European Union's excuses for not meeting at all. They were trying to play the game, the strategy they'd played with Theresa May, which was brinkmanship, and Theresa May always caved. And Boris Johnson, he made clear he was happy to go without a deal. There is going to be a deal, but it's going to be a incomplete deal. And that's why Britain and the European Union are still living with the problems with a bad deal. So some of it is a good deal and some of it's a bad deal. It's at least in the unambiguous sense that some things were not agreed, such as fisheries, or incompletely agreed. And now we have a fisheries war, right? This was the inevitable consequence of two sides that were prepared to go to the wire, to go almost to the deadline, but they were still intent on having a deal that they could say, oh, look at us, we pragmatically had a deal, we're great negotiators, and all the rest of it. So there were three main issues that were still at issue at the end of 2020 as they were at the beginning of 2020, and the consequences we still live with. So one is fisheries, as I indicated. The European Union wanted to continue its pre-existing free access to British waters, British fisheries, for another 50 years. So under the European Union fisheries policy, any member state could fish in any other member state's waters, but actually only a few member states had fisheries of any value, and that was Britain, Portugal, France, Ireland. That was pretty much it. North Sea, Norway, the Netherlands were fishing mostly in British waters. So fisheries, it's not a big industry, but it was very symbolic of sovereignty. Britain, the European Union wanted sovereignty over British fisheries for at least 50 years, and Britain wasn't prepared to agree to that. The second issue is fair competition. The European Union wanted compliance, wanted Britain to comply on all labour law, all environmental protection law, all subsidies law. So this was mostly domestic subsidies. So the European Union didn't want Britain to subsidize any of its own industry, because the European Union would consider that unfair trading practice, even though the European Union subsidizes domestic industries all the time, largely for electoral reasons. So if there's a member state or a constituency which is not as pro-EU as it should be, they will get a lot of subsidies. But the European Union didn't want Britain doing that. And it was called state aid, which is kind of a confusing phrase. It doesn't mean international aid, it means central government or federal government aiding domestic industries to boost their trading posture with the European Union. And then the third issue is governance. The European Union wanted the power to impose punitive tariffs on any British violations of the free trade agreement, which is what Britain really wanted. And the European Union wanted those all of those things, in fact, to be subject to the European Court of Justice, which Britain had already said it would not allow itself to remain party to. So European Court of Justice is supranational. It overrides any national court. And Britain said no to that. So those are the three issues. So what happens? You get to this deadline, right? So you can read this. If you replay this as a video, you can read this in your own time. There's crazy brinkmanship going on all through December, and you get to December 24th, which is why the agreement is known informally as the Christmas Eve Agreement. Formally, it's known as the it's known as the United Kingdom European Union Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or TCA. Huge document. That's why I like this photograph, because that's Boris Johnson signing it. 1,225 pages in the English language. No, it's signed on the 24th of December. I mean, talk about brinkmanship. The draft, nobody gets the draft. Nobody, that includes other politicians, not just the public. Politicians don't get the draft until the 26th of December. Remember, Britain has to leave on the 31st of December. So talk about last minute. It's ratified by Parliament on the 30th of December, overwhelmingly, but let's be honest, few members of Parliament read it. Few are still journalists. The public don't really understand it, apart from the sort of talking points they're getting on the news. It becomes active end of 31st of December. Now, the European Union drags its feet, so it doesn't ratify it until April of this year. So technically, it was being executed. So pragmatically, it was de facto, but until it was ratified, it was not really de jure. So that was an interesting wrinkle. There was some uncertainty: would the European Union even ratify it? And this was a parliamentary decision. The EU Parliament usually does what it's told by the executive, but you know, there was some strange machinations going on there. People were leveraging it for their European Union parties were leveraging it for their own purposes. So what could they get out of the European Union in return for promising to ratify it, which they eventually do towards the end of April. So, you know, that's only last month. I mean, just you do appreciate how long this has been going on, nearly 5 years, and the negotiations dragged out, and they're still being dragged out, right? So this is where we see the unresolved issues, or the incompletely agreed issues, are still ongoing. So fisheries, we have a fisheries war. Why? So in that TCA, the European Union doesn't get its 50 years of continuing access. It does get 5.5 years of continuing access under the terms of Britain's original entry to the European Union. In June of 2026, Britain regains only 25% of its fisheries. So the European Union still retains access to most of the fisheries. So Britain does not get sovereignty over its fisheries at the end of these 5.5 years. What happens after that is unclear, because after June 2026, the fisheries are subject to an annual renegotiation. Think about how crazy that is. You're annually going to renegotiate the terms of your shared fisheries access. You're going to have the brinkmanship all over again. You know, going to the deadline, the end of the year. You know, look, backroom deals, lots of pretense. You got an agreement, and then the cycle begins again. So fisheries are this is a nightmare that's going to keep on giving. Right, number two, which I previewed earlier, was fair competition. Under terms of the TCA, Britain does get what it wants in terms of zero tariff, zero quota trade. It's free trade in that sense. However, it's only free trade in goods. And the reason for this is European Union enjoys a trade surplus to the United Kingdom in goods, right? Manufactured goods like cars and so forth. So it's in the EU's interest to have zero tariff, zero quota trade, because it's a net exporter of goods. Britain is a net exporter of services, The European Union drags its feet on services to the extent there's no part of the TCA which really settles services. There are framework agreements on particular services, and the framework agreements are very vague. They sort of say things like both sides commit to being fair to each other, but they don't specify, what value of trade or what state subsidies for trade in services will count as a violation or anything like that. Again, it's all subject to renegotiation. And this is problematic mostly for Britain, not for the European Union, because Britain has a net surplus of trade towards the European Union in financial services, particularly, but services in general. So that still needs to be resolved. Now, Britain has a win on state aid. Remember, that refers to central government within the country, domestic industries. Britain retains its original demand that it wants to be able to give state aid to its own industries. The European Union drops its opposition to that. It drops its claim that that's unfair trading practices. However, European Union puts in a clause that says you can only use state aid if you're protecting a domestic industry against a market failure rather than protecting an industry from foreign trade, foreign imports. And which is to say it bans protectionism. So you can't aid an industry just to protect it from foreign trade. That would be protectionism. And the European Union reserves the right to cancel the whole agreement if it says Britain is in violation of that. And it's not subject to any adjudication. The European Union can unilaterally withdraw. So this is the sword of Damocles held over Britain, where there can be a lot of issue linkage here. So if the European Union doesn't like what it gets in fisheries, it can say, well, you're paying, your bicycle assemblers industry some money, some tax breaks that we consider state aid, and we're going to cut the whole TCA if you don't give us what we want on fisheries. And we can do it unilaterally. So this is a real problem. None of this is subject to normal trade, which is subject to the World Trade Organization. This is a sort of bilateral, but it doesn't really count as bilateral because the other party is supranational. So it's all very confusing, and a lot of the processes of governing this agreement are historically worked out on the fly, and the parties will claim that there's precedent for this and this is the proper way to do it, and we're rule of law and the other side is not rule of law. But in practice, there is no rule of law here. It's whatever each party spins as the right thing. We're doing the right thing and the other side is wrong. So there's a lot of moral hazard here. So be prepared for that, particularly at the end of 2021. Where both sides will be spinning things and using effectively political propaganda to get what they want rather than the rule of law. That's a sort of an irony in this agreement, because everybody's, particularly the European Union, talking about it being the superior rule of law body here. All right, trying to move on. The third issue I previewed was governance. Who governs what? Right, the key score on the British side was it avoided being subject to the European Court of Justice. However, either party can withdraw unilaterally from the TCA, as I indicated earlier. The European Union provides itself with a lot more causes to withdraw. So if it unilaterally decides that Britain is not playing level, this is called the level playing field, if it is not aligned with the European Union on human rights, then it can unilaterally withdraw. So if Britain, is harder on China than the European Union, that's not a level playing field. On the issue of Uyghurs or Hong Kong, like Britain tends to be quicker to condemn China for abuses of the Hong Kongese than the European Union. So there's lots of issues of human rights where there's not a level playing field, and in theory, one side could withdraw on that excuse, on that pretext. Right. The other score for the British side was the agreement is governed by a partnership council which gives Britain a veto on European Union directives. So that's different than Britain being subject to the European Court of Justice, where it would not have a veto. The European Court of Justice would just rule and Britain is obliged to obey, which is the same as membership. Britain has this veto in this Partnership Council. So it's in theory, they are equals. There are only two parties and they vote as equals in this Partnership Council. Well, you might think, what the hell's the point of a Partnership Council? You might as well do it by diplomacy. And that's a good point. But here's the problem. This is why the EU prefers the Partnership Council. There are 19 committees that execute and even amend the agreement without public oversight. They consult non-governmental organizations, which is how the European Union does a lot of its legislative and regulatory business. It doesn't consult electors, and it doesn't even consult the Parliament on a lot of things. It consults non-governmental organizations. So this is very technocratic rule. It's not in the British tradition. These committees favor the European Union federalist tradition, not the British tradition, which is public oversight, direct accountability through a minister to the voter. The staff on these committees are not elected. So there's no democratic process in these committees, except you might say indirectly through either the representatives in the representative democracy, Britain, the government that agrees to these particular staff or appoints these staff are ultimately accountable to the voters at general election times, national election times. There is one minister who is co-chair of the Partnership Council, but everybody else is a technocrat, pretty much. I mean, yes, they are, except you might spin some of them as appointees. But on the European Union side, they're really going to be technocrats, professional civil servants, public servants, not politicians. Now, in red, there's even more serious issue here, which I haven't even indicated yet, and that's Northern Ireland. The prior agreement that Theresa May reached on Northern Ireland was allowed to let stand. It was one of the concessions Boris Johnson allowed. There was a prior Northern Ireland withdrawal. It was called a withdrawal agreement. It was where the European Union insisted that Northern Ireland remain effectively inside the free trade area, the European Union's free market customs union, so that Britain would be forced to have a border between the island of Ireland, that's Northern Ireland and the Republic of Eire or Ireland. So that the geopolitical unit, the island of Ireland, there would have to be a border between the island of Ireland and Britain being England, Wales, and Scotland. There'd have to be a border in the North Sea. So Northern Ireland would remain a province of the British Union, like a state in the United States. It's a province like a state. So it remained part of the British Union, but for economically, it would be part of the European Union still. So here's a good quote. The deal struck between London and Brussels does not represent a decisive breakthrough for popular sovereignty, but it does eliminate some of the worst aspects of European Union membership and create space for the emergence of a real alternative. Now look at this bit here. It does eliminate some of the worst aspects of European Union membership. The corollary to that is that Britain is still partly a member of the European Union in some de facto terms, like fisheries. Britain is still, in effect, practically, de facto, a member of the common fisheries policy, at least for the next 5.5 years, intimately, and something new can be negotiated after that period. So a lot of the complaints about this agreement are from Brexiteers who say, hang on, there's a lot of things we seem to be still acting as if we're still a member. So this is not quite a Brexit agreement. Right, another thing that has upset Brexiteers is that Remainers, so here is Lord Adonis, he was an appointee by during Tony Blair's administration, Lord Adonis, very strong, outspoken Remainer. December 31st, 2020, he tweets, you know, the campaign for Britain to rejoin Europe starts at midnight. So the Remainers, rhetorically, they haven't given up. Now it's no longer about stopping Britain leave. Now it's about rejoining. And it's not just on the Labour Party side. There are Conservatives who are staunch Remainers too. So Michael Heseltine, Lord Heseltine, who was a challenger for Margaret Thatcher for leadership of the party in the 1980s, he's saying the same thing. The battle starts again. You know, he's campaigning to rejoin. So what that is evidence to you is that the tensions about Brexit versus Remain haven't entirely gone away. Now, the good news, and this is a neat slide capturing some of this, some of the Remainer hysteria about what was going on, that trade would collapse, there'd be these huge queues, lines of vehicles trying to get into the European Union, and trade would break down because nobody would know what they were doing, etc. None of that has panned out. So trade flows pretty much normally, and has done, apart, in fact, from coronavirus issues, where, in fact, some countries have banned flows from Britain, where Britain had a variant. More recently, Britain has banned flows from, say, France, because France has a COVID variant that Britain doesn't have. But trade is going fine. There have been some misreports of, you know, it's costing Britain this or costing Britain that, and they've all turned out to be, what would you call them? Scurrilous, right? Scurrilous, mischievous. Right, there were some issues of what we call non-tariff barriers. So if you've done any international political economy, you know, non-tariff barriers are where a country is not charging imports a special fee because you're foreign, but they're using procedural delays to ruin your goods. So a good example is fish and meats. They were held up at the European Union border. So British exports of fish and meats, they were held up until they rotted, because the officials there would claim, oh, we're not really sure what we're doing. Again, this was mischievous. It was, you know, if they didn't know what they were doing, that's their problem. If they really didn't know what they were doing, a solution to that is you temporarily pass things and say the paperwork will catch up with you later. You don't stop things at the border until they rot. So this was just malicious non-tariff barriers. Okay, so let's move on to trade and get to. Well, I'm going to skip over the vaccines war. I'm just going to note this slide is here. I'm just going to give the video time to catch that, so that you can read that at your own time. The vaccine war is very symbolic of both the differences in national and supranational approaches. European Union was very slow to react to vaccines. Britain was very quick. And then they had effectively a trade war on vaccines, where the European Union said, we're not going to export, we're not going to allow the export of vaccines to Britain, even if they've been manufactured by British-owned companies, or they've been already contracted to the British government. And that was, you know, but there was back and forth, and eventually European Union backed down on that. And for some journalists like Douglas Murray, this was, so he's a historical Brexiteer. This was evidence of the European Union tearing itself apart in a counterproductive sense. The European Union saying, Britain, you know, you're putting, one of the claims was that Britain was putting European Union lives at risk with its selfish monopolization of vaccines. Well, that wasn't true. European Union hadn't contracted because it hadn't decided what its policy was. And then for the European Union to spin its own culpability by then blaming Britain was counterproductive. That just reinforces people's dissatisfaction with the European Union. And if you've been following this news, member states started to defect on European Union policy, including, like, started with Hungary and Czechoslovakia. They went and got Russian vaccines, and then even Germany, right, which is the core member, it defected on European Union policy on vaccines. There are still issues that remain unresolved. So the Northern Ireland border issue is still being worked out. So there's the border in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of Britain. The European Union claims that it doesn't, that it needs to be checking things that Britain claims it doesn't need to check, such as cars, right? So this is an interesting case where European Union said we need to check whether there's any dirt on the cars that Britain exports through Northern Ireland effectively into the European Union, because the dirt could be considered an environmental hazard, a hazard to livestock. So normally you would enforce that protocol on the livestock. The European Union was enforcing it on new cars in case there was dirt on their wheels or something, right? Now, for Britain, that, again, this is an exercise of a non-tariff barrier. You're just being malicious. You're punishing Britain. You're finding ways to punish Britain through its exports. From the European Union side, they claim they don't know that the agreement was reached too late, and they're still working out how they're going to enforce it. So here's another reaction, particularly to that Northern Irish dispute. Another journalist, historical Brexiteer, the Trumpian European Union has demolished its final reasons for existing. This is from February of this year. So European Union being compared with Trump's bombast and spin. Now, there is a serious issue in Northern Ireland, that the disputes, the difficulties in getting trade through Northern Ireland could start the Troubles, what are called the Troubles. So this is the ethnic religious conflict in Northern Ireland between mostly Catholics, mostly Protestants, mostly pro-British Union, mostly pro-Irish on the Union on the other side. There's concern that the peace agreement could break down, exacerbated by tensions over this trade. All right, so I don't have time to go into that. I'm just going to leave that on the video for you to catch up with. I do want to get to the fisheries. I'm just going to note the Northern Ireland issue gets conflated with the vaccine wars, because it's essentially a trade war over vaccines. Northern Ireland is a trade war over the passaging of the trafficking of trade through Northern Ireland. Then you get the fisheries wars. So because I mentioned this earlier, I just want to close on this. So remember, the European Union maintains its common fisheries policy with Britain for 5.5 years. Now in May this month, so middle of this month, this year, the French president threatened to block a deal on financial services if Britain was not fairer in allowing access to fisheries. So this is exactly what I was warning you about earlier. The TCA allows issue linkage. Because the European Union can unilaterally withdraw, it can say, if you don't give us what we want in fisheries, we're going to claim that you're not playing a level playing field on financial services, and then we'll just break the whole TCA, whole agreement. But this was a false claim. So now we know that the British government had not actually refused any fishing applications from continental European Union member applicants, and that's nearly 2,000. So European Union, the same big fishing companies continue to fish in British waters that always did. So that was a falsely evidenced claim. Now, one part of Britain that becomes an issue. So these fishing licenses were issued by the central government, the national government. The Channel Islands, Britain has various tiny little provinces, territories, which are sort of like small states, like Rhode Island or something. One of those political units is the Channel Islands, which are closer to France. Here they are, they're closer to France than to Britain. The Channel Islands has a very small fisheries boundary of just 3 miles. France has a 6-mile limit. So there's not much fisheries for anybody to really care about. But the French government said the Channel Islands are not issuing licenses fairly. The French fishermen organized a blockade of the port. That's what this photograph up here is showing. Fishing boats are blockading the port of St. Helier over here. And there's a tense standoff between fishing boats and then between navies. The European Commission sided with France on this. Remember, the threat is that we cancel the whole TCA, the whole agreement. But the Channel Islands back down. They have their own government. They backed down, so they delayed their plan to issue any fishing licenses for another 2 months. That gets you into July, and then we'll see what happens. Probably the same issue will arise again. Let's see how I'm doing for time. Right, I'm going to end there just to give you some time to ask questions. Clearly, there's a lot of issues here. If I have not covered an issue which you're aware of through the news, please ask me. It's in this lecture. I just didn't have time to get to it because Brexit clearly is such a complex subject. So with that said, please, let's have your questions.
I see Mitchell's hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi, I was just wondering where the U.S. fits in all this, because over the past couple of years we heard like some talks from Brexiteers about siding more with the United States, like substituting the European Union market with the United States market because they're like roughly the same size in terms of GDP. I was just wondering if you have like any news about where those trade deals stand.
Yeah. So well, the outstanding, this is the correct way to say it, the outstanding policy of the Biden administration is that Britain cannot start negotiating for any special free trade agreement with the United States government until it has clarified issues such as the Northern Ireland issue with the European Union. So it's an outstanding policy, as in it precedes Biden's election in November. So it was a campaign policy which continues into his administration. He has not addressed the issue during his time as president, or not just him personally, but his administration. It has not addressed the issue, so we assume the policy is outstanding. As far as I know, there are no negotiations between the United States government and the British government on any special free trade agreement. One of those reasons is possibly the British government's own fault, right? The main reason is going to be the Biden administration isn't interested. It's got its own bandwidth problems. Britain is not a priority. There aren't domestic votes. There aren't American votes in being nice to Britain on this issue. The Biden administration is highly supranational, transnational in its orientation, so it tends to be pro-EU in this particular fight. It still has a special relationship with Britain, but that's sort of at an agency level more than between the administrations. The administrations are not, in practical terms, particularly close, although obviously the rhetoric is very close. So the main problem here is Biden administration isn't that interested, and it doesn't have the bandwidth because it's got a lot of other diplomatic problems to deal with. So far as the British government is at fault here, the British government has its bandwidth problems. I've said in other lectures, Boris Johnson is a man who can't juggle more than one ball at a time, and his administration is a lot like that in general. They've just reached free trade agreements with Japan, Australia. That's pretty much it for big trade partners. and we're many years into previous trade negotiations if we count Theresa May's administration. So the British government is not good at negotiating trade agreements, and that's, I should mention, I'm blaming the administration, but the administration blames the civil service, so the unelected part of government. It lost a lot of its capacity for negotiating trade agreements because it was a member of the European Union, and once you're a member of the European Union, you're not allowed to negotiate trade. The European Union does it for you. So there's sort of a capacity problem there, but the whole civil service needs reform, and everybody agrees on that. So bottom line is, we're not going to see, in my judgment, my assessment, we're not going to see any trade negotiations start this year, and possibly not next year. And you know, the Biden administration can claim, well, we're not going to start anything until Britain resolves its issues with the European Union on its current TCA, and that's a fair point, right?
Thank you.
Okay, so I see that we still have a few questions, but I also noticed that we're near the end of the class. So before people might start leaving, while everyone is here, I'd just like to make a short note because this is the last lecture for Dr. Newsom. And then we can have Jacqueline, and I think there was Jack also, to ask their questions if you're available to stay a little bit more over time.
Sure.
So yeah, I'd like to thank Dr. Newsom on behalf of Dr. Willoughby and everyone else here for the amazing lectures he's given us throughout this quarter.
Thank you. You've been a great audience, all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, and I personally learned so much from your insights, and I'm sure everyone else here has done so as well. So why don't we give Dr. Newsom a big round of applause before people start leaving? Yeah. Okay,
Thank you,
great.
everybody. Thank you.
Would you be available to stay? I still see Jacqueline has a question. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I'll probably stop recording now. Is that okay? Or should I just leave it on?
You can leave it on.
Okay.
And then it's on record, depending on what Professor Willoughby wants to do with it. Yeah.
All right. Great. Jacqueline, I think you can go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask about like Brexit and immigration, like how Brexit is going to impact like flow of refugees that Britain's going to take in, or in the how, like same kind of question with the EU, like how does like how is like immigration and refugee status being impacted?
It's a great question, and unfortunately, it's a very complicated answer. So if I can oversimplify it, essentially Britain had, under the Theresa May's administration, had committed to abiding by the key agreements on migration that had been agreed under European Union membership anyway, such as the so-called Dublin Agreement, which is, it covers a lot of issues in immigration. The key part of that is that there is supposed to be reciprocal, reciprocal repatriation, that's it. Reciprocal repatriation of migrants, that in theory, if a refugee claims asylum in Britain, but has passed through another European Union member state, under international law, it's supposed to go back to the first state of entry. The Dublin Agreement allows for that. However, under various precedents in British courts, the British courts have interpreted human rights protections as preventing repatriation. So the net result of this is that in most cases, once a migrant is inside Britain, they are given right to remain by they're given de facto, because it rather like similar to America, the migrant is documented, if at all, right? They're documented, and then they're said that keep in touch. At some point, we're going to ask you to come to court to hear your case. And once they get to court, they're usually, historically, they've been granted right to remain under human right, at least under human rights concerns, as in it would violate their human rights to force them to leave, the economic hardship or whatever. Now, that's the status quo. However, we have a Home Secretary who is kind of like the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and State Department rolled into one. Home Secretary Priti Patel is very strong on restoring border security, and she has variously proposed to send all migrants back to the first country of entry in the European Union, to have quotas, to punish other countries like that cooperate on stopping the flow of migration that has its origins in France. So what you can say is that the Johnson's administration has policies to change its legacy policies that it's carried forward from the European Union, which is the legacy policy is essentially like free movement. At least if you're a refugee or an asylum seeker, it's really free movement. But this Home Secretary wants to change that. So there's a lot of uncertainty about this because the policy proposal might sound certain, but there's uncertainty within the cabinet about who would support it. So Priti Patel, Home Secretary, seems to be somewhat on her own within the cabinet in being strong on it, and the cabinet members are sort of sitting on the fence thinking, well, what's the public think? We're not going to commit either way until we really know what's good for us politically. In general, the British public tends to be highly split on immigration. Everybody says they want to reduce immigration, but when you ask them how, would you make it harder to claim asylum, they say no. So it's kind of it's kind of contradiction in public opinion. If you can't make it harder for people to claim asylum, then you're going to have free migration, free movement, because at the moment anybody can claim asylum, and it's practically impossible to refuse that claim under case law. So yeah, this may not be a very satisfactory answer. The bottom line is to be determined. I think that's the best answer.
Thank you.
Jack, I saw your hand raised at some point. Is your question resolved, or would you like to?
Yeah, I was just gonna. Don't worry, this is a quick one. In terms of sort of the TCA's relevance to national security issues, has it? And feel free to answer this with a simple yes or no. Has the TCA agreement changed in any way, either practically or just simply the perception of the UK's commitment to sort of the general defense of Europe, or has the existence of NATO sort of kept that from being an issue?
It's a great question and a very important one, and I wish I had more time to show you those slides, because again, it's a very complex answer. Britain has a formal policy of prioritizing its membership veto, but it also has a policy of cooperating with the European Union on defense. Formally speaking, Britain is not a member of most of the programs that European Union has started towards a common defense and foreign policy. However, it is a member of some of those programs. So it is a member of various common defense acquisition programs, for instance, the defense funding pools, things like that, research pools. It has signed in some of the components of what the European Union calls PESCO, which is the permanently structured cooperation initiative, PESCO. PESCO aims towards common defense, like there'd be one military, there'd be one acquisitions pool, one command system. It would be NATO on steroids. It would be way more integrated NATO. It's essentially a military like you're a single state, even you actually wouldn't integrate the member state before you had the common military. So Britain's not signed up into that, but it is signed up into some of those programs. I think in terms of forecasting what's going to happen, I cannot foresee in political terms or societal terms how Britain will ever prioritize European Union defense policy over NATO defense policy. I'm sure NATO will remain Britain's priority. However, there is uncertainty about redundancy between NATO and the European Union. And I indicated some of those issues when I was talking about the northern flank, but there are these competitions and redundancies between NATO's military posture and European Union's posture, and Britain is somewhat engaged in some of those things through even the northern group. So there are some unresolved issues in where Britain is going to draw the line in participation in the European Union common defence policy in the end. And sorry, I had a final point on that, which was what was I going to say? Yeah, so I think a lot will depend in the immediate term on what the next US administration is like. So if Biden wins a second term, you can expect the British government to be much more willing to sign into European Union initiatives. If, say, Trump comes back, or somebody like Trump who is antagonistic to the European Union and wants a more robust NATO, you can expect Britain to divest some of what it's already invested in the European Union and make sure it's investing more heavily in NATO. So some of this will be domestic, some of this will be, well, domestic political, but also international political.
Right. Thank you. That was a really great, concise answer. I definitely think I sort of got the gist of it there. Definitely.
Sure. Well, next time you take this course, make sure Randy, Professor Willoughby, schedules that whole other lecture, which is all about NATO, right?
I'll lobby it. Don't worry.
Okay, so I don't see any more hands unless anyone wants to ask more. Otherwise, I'll see the rest of you next week. And thank you so much again, Dr. Newsom, for being here.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Yalian, for your help. Good luck to you and everybody else.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.